January 1944. A grey dawn rose over East Anglia, thin as breath through frost. The hardstand shimmered with rime and spilled oil, each drop freezing before it reached the ground. Mechanics worked without speaking, their motions practiced to the point of silence. In the half-light stood the object of all this ritual, a four-engine giant of riveted aluminum and ambition. The United States Army Air Forces called it the B-17 Flying Fortress. The newspapers called it invincible. The men who flew it knew better. They knew it was a miracle, yes, but a miracle that could kill them without a single shot fired in anger. The fortress represented industrial arithmetic made solid, 35,000 rivets in each wing, 4 Wright Cyclone engines, 10 machine guns, 5 miles of wiring, and 1,700 gallons of high-octane fuel. Add altitude, temperature, and human error, and the equation often balanced in blood. What scared the crews was not only the enemy over Bremen or Schweinfurt, it was the system that had built the ship, the philosophy of mass production and standardization that demanded that a bomber be strong enough to survive flak, yet cheap enough to lose by the hundreds. It was war by statistics, and every crewman was a digit inside the formula. From the start, the fortress was a contradiction. Its very name promised safety. Its nickname promised invulnerability. In truth, it was neither fortress nor sanctuary. Its armor, quarter-inch steel plates behind the pilot's seat, a bullet-resistant windscreen, self-sealing fuel tanks gave comfort, but no certainty. The men understood that aluminum was light for a reason, so the airplane could climb high enough to live longer than the fuel in its tanks. Armor thick enough to stop cannon shells would have kept the B-17 earthbound. Every ounce saved bought altitude. Every ounce saved might also cost a life. Inside, the fortress was a narrow, echoing tunnel of metal. The pilot and co-pilot sat beneath a greenhouse of glass that magnified the light and the cold in equal measure. Behind them, the navigator hunched over his table, surrounded by cables and oxygen lines that snaked like veins through the fuselage. In the waist, the gunners crouched beside open windows where the slipstream screamed louder than thought. The bomb bay divided the aircraft like a canyon, a catwalk 6 inches wide, 2 feet above a 4,000-pound heart of high explosive. Men crossed it on their knees when turbulence struck, knowing one misplaced boot could tear open the skin between them and the sky. The dangers that haunted briefings were not always German. Oxygen was the first enemy. Above 20,000 feet, each crewman lived by a system of pipes, valves, and masks that leaked, froze, or burned with terrifying ease. The low-pressure network ran the length of the ship, feeding 10 stations at once. A single nick in the aluminum tubing could fill the fuselage with pure oxygen. One spark from an electric suit could turn it into a torch. The Army Air Forces logged dozens of non-combat losses, traced to oxygen fires that spread in seconds. Men learned to test fittings by smell. Oxygen had none, but rubber seals did. They learned to fear the hiss that meant the system was alive in the worst way. Cold was the second. At 25,000 feet, the temperature fell to 50 below zero. The B-17's fuselage was unpressurized, its thin skin a sieve for air that had no mercy. The cockpit heaters helped the pilots. Aft of the bomb bay, the warmth vanished. Crews flew encased in electrically heated suits that connected by cords to outlets along the fuselage, an umbilical network that could short out at any bend. The same wire that saved a man from frostbite could burn through the cloth of his flight gear. Veterans spoke of fingers blackened by frost and ankles blistered by overheating within minutes of each other. "The fortress will keep you alive," one gunner wrote, "if she doesn't cook you first." Then there was the first. Visibility, or rather the illusion of it. The fortress seemed open glass in the nose, in the turret, in the tail, but the pilot's forward vision was a tunnel framed by the engines. In formation flight, he could see the wingtip of the next ship and nothing else. Every takeoff in fog meant trusting the unseen crew 50 yards ahead. Every climb through cloud meant risking a collision with comrades who shared the same timing, the same heading, the same briefed altitude. The B-17 was designed for formation warfare. Its overlapping fields of machine gun fire could turn a sky into a cage of bullets. But that geometry worked both ways. A minor miscalculation, one ship too slow, one too high, and the formation became its own flak. Weight was a third, subtler terror. Fully loaded with bombs, fuel, and ammunition, a B-17 weighed over 30 tons. The pilots joked that it didn't so much take off as negotiate with gravity. In the drizzle of an English winter, runways became skating rinks. 4 throttles had to rise in perfect symmetry. One lazy engine could twist the ship into a ground loop that snapped wings like matchsticks. The training films showed the takeoff roll as a calm acceleration into destiny. The crews knew the truth. Each liftoff was a gamble played in seconds between stall and overspeed, lift and disaster. The fortress demanded faith in arithmetic, the right power, the right angle, the right weight distribution, and punished any error with 10,000 gallons of flaming proof. What unnerved many veterans was how indifferent the airplane seemed to its occupants. The B-17 was built to endure, not to comfort. When a fortress returned riddled with flak holes, reporters praised its toughness. The crews looked at the holes differently. Each one marked a fragment that could have passed 6 inches higher or a second earlier and made the headline "Crew Lost" instead of "Fortress Returns." Survival depended as much on rivet placement as on courage. A man might live because a mechanic back in Seattle had tightened a bolt to spec. He might die because another hadn't. In the mess halls, new arrivals listened to veterans describe the aircraft in tones of respect edged with resentment. "She'll bring you home," they said, "but she'll try to kill you first." The men learned to anthropomorphize the machine because it behaved like a living thing, temperamental, loyal, vengeful. One day an engine would run smooth as silk. The next, it would cough and spit black oil over the wing with no warning. Electric systems that tested perfect on the ground would short out in thin air. Hydraulic lines burst like veins when the temperature plunged. Each mission began with the knowledge that mechanical perfection was a theoretical condition, not a practical one. The fortress inspired faith because it embodied the American war machine, massive, methodical, and confident in engineering. Yet that same faith bred fear. Industrial war demanded scale. Scale demanded compromise. To build thousands of bombers, every design had to favor production over comfort, simplicity over redundancy. The B-17 was proof that victory could be manufactured, but also that safety could not. It was a machine optimized for the mission, not for the men. Inside its aluminum shell, 10 human beings operated as replaceable components in a system larger than any of them could see. The young co-pilot who stepped into his first B-17 on that January morning might have believed the poster, "The Flying Fortress, toughest ship in the air." By dusk, he would understand what the veterans meant when they called it the old man's airplane. It demanded discipline, calculation, humility before the laws of physics. It rewarded precision and punished hope. To fear it was not cowardice, but comprehension. The fortress was the perfect symbol of the new warfare, mechanical, statistical, and pitiless. It was built to save nations, not individuals. And for those who served inside its cold belly, the greatest enemy was often the beautiful, merciless machine itself. At 25,000 feet, breath itself became a luxury. The human body, designed for the lazy density of sea-level air, began to fail within minutes above 20,000. Hands went numb, vision narrowed, and thought turned slow, like syrup in winter. The B-17's salvation and its secret terror was the oxygen system that webbed through its fuselage in pipes of aluminum no thicker than a man's finger. It delivered life in ounces of pressure, a steady hiss that kept men awake and sane. It was also a bomb waiting for a spark. The fortress's low-pressure oxygen network began behind the pilot's seat, where 12 green cylinders stood like artillery shells in a rack. They fed a manifold of valves and lines running the length of the aircraft, branching to every crew station, the nose, the waist, the tail. Each man connected through a flexible hose to his mask, breathing the ship's manufactured air. At sea level, the cylinders were harmless. At altitude, where the pressure dropped and moisture froze, the system became volatile. A leak anywhere filled the cabin with a mist of pure oxygen, invisible and deadly. One shorted wire, one spark from a heated glove, could ignite it faster than any bomb fuse. The Army Air Force's accident reports were filled with euphemisms: ship lost, cause undetermined, fire of unknown origin, but the crews knew. They called it oxygen flash. A gunner in the 91st Bomb Group remembered it like a ghost story. You'd see a blue light for half a second, then nothing but smoke. It burned clean, no flame, no smell, just gone. The fire fed on itself, eating the air that men depended on. A fortress could turn into a torch at 25,000 feet and be gone before the formation leader noticed a gap in the box. The danger didn't end with combat damage. Maintenance itself could be deadly. Ground crews tested the lines with soap bubbles, checking for leaks. On cold mornings, condensation froze inside valves. Mechanics thawed them with blowtorches until regulations forbade it. Too many ships had vanished on the apron. Heated flight suits, wired through plug-in sockets, ran within inches of the oxygen lines. The insulation frayed, the connections arced. A tiny spark could feed on the atmosphere like dry tinder in wind. Veterans said they could hear it when they plugged in a faint pop beneath the engine noise, and everyone prayed it wasn't the sound of ignition. The irony was cruel. The same technology that let the fortress climb higher than German guns made it lethal in its own right. Crews learned to treat oxygen like nitroglycerin. They checked every fitting twice, cleaned the masks with alcohol, taped frayed lines, and never, ever smoked before altitude. Cigarettes, banned at 10,000 feet, were permitted again on descent, and the first drag after a mission was as ceremonial as communion. Men had spent hours surrounded by invisible vapor that would have turned that cigarette into a funeral pyre. Fire could start in other ways too. Every system on the B-17 depended on electricity: heated suits, gun turrets, radio sets, interphones. The wiring ran through bulkheads in bundles tied with waxed string. Combat damage could strip insulation bare, turning a bullet hole into a spark gap. Fuel lines ran nearby, feeding the four engines through a maze of pumps. A single tracer from an attacking fighter could enter the wing and ignite the mixture. Once started, an aviation fuel fire could melt aluminum like wax. Crews carried portable extinguishers filled with carbon tetrachloride, a chemical that suffocated flames and men with equal efficiency. There were stories passed quietly in mess halls: the ship that exploded after the radio operator's heated glove shorted out, the fortress that burned in flight when a waist gunner's electric suit wire touched an oxygen hose, the pilot, who tried to dive to extinguish a cabin fire and lost both wings when the fuel tanks detonated. None of these appeared in official communiques. The myth of the flying fortress demanded confidence, not cautionary tales. Newspapers wrote of aircraft returning home on 3 engines, wings shredded, but never of those that vanished in their own fireball before reaching the channel. Inside the bomber, the danger had a smell: the faint metallic tang of oxygen and the sweet, acrid odor of hot wiring. Veterans said they could sense it before the gauges changed, a sixth sense learned from fear. The first puff of smoke meant seconds, not minutes. Everyone knew their escape routes: nose through the hatch, tail through the ventral door, waist through the open windows. But fire moved faster than panic. At altitude, oxygen-fed flames burned invisible. A man might not even see he was on fire until the suit melted against his skin. What saved some crews was the same engineering that doomed others. The fortress was divided by bulkheads, each section isolated by design. Fire in the nose might spare the waist. Flames in the radio room might die before reaching the bomb bay. Many ships landed with holes burnt through the fuselage, blackened aluminum curling like paper, but the rest of the crew alive. The aircraft's compartmentalization, an architect's decision made in Seattle, became the difference between survival and vaporization. In training, instructors lectured on oxygen safety with a reverence bordering on fear. New crews watched films showing blue flames racing through transparent tubes, melting them in seconds. They were told to cut the oxygen master switch in case of fire, but few remembered in combat. Panic made men forget the location of the valve, or the cord burned before they reached it. Some gunners carried pocket knives to slash lines if fire broke out. a desperate measure that at least gave them a chance to breathe the thin, freezing air long enough to bail out. The official doctrine said the fortress was safe. The men inside knew that safe was a relative term. They lived by arithmetic. Oxygen gave life, but too much of it gave fire. Electricity gave warmth, but too much gave sparks. The system that sustained them demanded absolute discipline, and in war, discipline eroded fast. The B-17's enemies flew Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, but it also carried another enemy within its walls, an invisible one that hissed and waited. The crews called it by many names: the ghost, the blue flash, the invisible fuse. It was the price of flying higher than the sky could sustain, of waging industrial war inside a machine that needed no enemy to destroy itself. Cold was the truest enemy of the fortress. It was not romantic, not noble, not the clean kind of suffering captured in newsreels. It was mechanical cold, the kind that crept through metal faster than through skin, that turned oxygen to ice crystals and lubricants to glue. At altitude, the thermometer in the navigator's station often read 50 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than the summit of Everest. At that temperature, flesh froze in seconds. And there, inside a $300,000 machine built to carry men across a continent of sky, survival depended on a technology barely a decade old: electric heat running through cloth. The Army Air Forces issued the Type F-1 heated flying suit, an awkward patchwork of olive-drab fabric stitched with resistance wires. It plugged into sockets along the aircraft's walls, each drawing current from the same system that powered the radios and turret motors. In theory, it was genius warmth at the turn of a dial. In practice, it was a fire hazard and a torture device. If one wire shorted or the voltage surged, a man might smell insulation burning before he felt the pain. Many crews bore scars where wires crossed elbows or knees. One waist gunner described it simply: "You froze until you burned." The suit's cords, coiled like vines between crewmen's legs, looping under ammunition belts and oxygen hoses. A careless move could yank the plug out of the wall and plunge a man into instant agony as the cold reclaimed him. Gloves stiffened with frost. Boots froze solid against the deck. Every motion at altitude took calculation. To adjust a gun mount or reload a belt meant pulling off mittens and risking frostbite in 30 seconds. Crewmen tied strings to triggers so they could fire without exposing their fingers. Photographs of smiling gunners in sheepskin jackets disguised the truth. Most of those smiles were rehearsed for the camera before takeoff, while their blood was still liquid. Inside the ship, warmth existed only in theory. The flight deck was the least miserable place, protected by engine heat that seeped through the firewall. Aft of the bomb bay was another world. The aluminum skin, only 1/8 inch thick, radiated the atmosphere's hostility. Every vibration transmitted through it the engine's thrum, the whine of the wind, the chatter of machine guns felt personal, like a living heartbeat of metal. The waist gunner's breath froze to the walls, forming rime that glittered under the feeble light bulbs. Even the ball turret, that glass sphere hanging beneath the belly, became a freezer suspended in air. A gunner entering it wore every layer he owned, yet his knees still locked with cold before the first flak burst appeared. Veterans remembered the irony. The airplane could burn men alive in one compartment while freezing others solid 2 meters away. A fortress hit by flak often lost electrical systems in one section, plunging half the crew into darkness and cold. In January 1944, the 379th Bomb Group recorded 5 cases of partial suit failure. One man's right glove caught fire. His left hand, unheated, turned white with frostbite. He survived both, but doctors later amputated 2 fingers for opposite reasons. The fortress, as one, a navigator said, made you pay in thermodynamics. The oxygen that sustained them froze too. At high altitude, moisture condensed inside the rubber hoses and crystallized. Men learned to thump their lines with a gloved hand every few minutes to keep them clear. If ice clogged a valve, a man could black out without realizing it. His mask frosted white, his head lolled forward, and he slipped quietly into anoxia. Comrades carried spare bottles and sometimes crawled through the fuselage to plug a man in before he died. To move through the plane at altitude meant crawling across a floor slick with frozen condensation, clutching a catwalk no wider than a boot, knowing the space beneath held 4,000 pounds of bombs and air thin as glass. Then there was noise, a constant roar that penetrated the body like vibration rather than sound. At 50 degrees, sound travelled differently. It vibrated through bones. Men could barely hear the interphone, their voices filtered through masks that froze to their faces. They learned to recognize each other's breathing patterns, the rhythm of panic or exhaustion. When the engines coughed or an air vent cracked, the sound was magnified into terror. Cold made everything brittle. The plexiglass in the nose could shatter from a single bullet. The gun mount seized, even the ammunition belts stiffened like metal snakes. It was not uncommon for a man to return from a mission with his face rimed in frost and his uniform reeking of burned insulation. Medical officers treated frostbite and electrical burns with the same ointment. Flight surgeons logged them under non-combat casualties, though every man knew the weather had been more faithful to the enemy than to them. In the worst conditions, condensation froze the control cables themselves, locking ailerons or rudders mid-flight. Pilots learned to fight the ship as much as they fought the Luftwaffe. To level a wing in thin air took muscle and nerve. To keep it steady in formation required faith that the man beside you was suffering the same. Crew humor masked the truth. They joked that the B-17 offered two temperatures, Hell and Hudson Bay. They drew cartoons of icicle-bearded gunners warming hands over a glowing electric socket. But behind the laughter lay an understanding that cold was a killer with perfect patience. It didn't explode like flak or strafe like fighters. It simply waited, inch by inch, for human frailty to slow. Every mission above 20,000 feet became a duel against thermodynamics, with no quarter given. On the ground, men thawed out beside stoves in the debriefing huts, hands shaking too hard to hold coffee cups. Frost-bitten faces blistered as warmth returned. Some wept without knowing it because the tears froze before they fell. Only when the engines stopped did the silence hit the sudden absence of vibration that had filled their bones for 8 hours. They would tell the intelligence officers about flak bursts and fighter passes, but rarely about the simple fact that the sky itself had tried to kill them. For every fortress lost to Messerschmitts, another limped home half-frozen, its crew alive by arithmetic. Voltage just high enough, oxygen just clear enough, endurance barely sufficient. And when dawn came again, and the order board read, "Mission scheduled," they went back into the cold, knowing the fortress feared no enemy more than its own environment, a flying fortress indeed, but one built of ice, fire, and human will. The briefing maps showed elegant geometry blue chalk lines tracing concentric circles of aircraft, combat boxes, layered by altitude and distance. To the planners at 8 Bomber Command, it was order made visible, a fortress in the sky, each ship covering the next with interlocking fields of fire. To the men who flew it, it was something else entirely organized chaos, a deadly ballet performed blind in cloud, trusting strangers they couldn't see. Every mission began with assembly. The word sounded harmless, like building a model or a church service. In reality, assembly was the most dangerous maneuver in the air war over Europe. The English winter hid everything under fog. Runways disappeared into white before the gear left the ground. Formations vanished inside the first 1,000 feet. Each group had its own timing. Take off every 30 seconds, climb on instruments to a prearranged altitude, circle above the buncher beacon, and wait for the others to find you. It was a choreography written in minutes and miles, but one mistake, one misread altimeter, or one pilot late on throttle, and aluminum met aluminum in the cloud. Crews learned to fear the sound of other engines most of all. You couldn't see another ship until it was too late. A low thrum, growing louder in the grey, meant another fortress somewhere close, closing fast. Veterans remembered moments of horror shapes materializing out of fog, wings overlapping, fuselages crossing by feet. In December 1943 alone, weather assembly accidents destroyed more B-17 seconds than enemy fighters. The official term was operational loss. The men had another word for it, friendly collision. Once assembled, the sky turned into a three-dimensional factory line. Hundreds of aircraft, stacked in precise intervals, 200 feet vertically, 1,000 feet horizontally, staggered in layers so that each gunner could defend his neighbors. The combat box had been designed by mathematicians at Air Force Tactical School in 1942. They calculated arcs of fire, sighting angles, and bomber dispersion like artillery tables. In the classroom, it worked perfectly. In the thin air over the North Sea, it demanded the reflexes of angels. Every turbulence, ripple, or throttle twitch magnified through the formation like a heartbeat out of sync. One ship dropped 10 feet too low, another climbed 20 too high, and suddenly the box folded in on itself. Pilots flew inches apart, sometimes so close they could see the other man's face through the cockpit glass. Formation flying was discipline distilled, no individual maneuvering, no improvisation. The fortress that drifted out of position became both target and threat. When flak erupted, the instinct was to break away. Training forbade it. You held the line because movement meant collision. One man's panic could kill 12 others who never saw the burst that frightened him. Fog and cloud made it worse. On many missions, the first 30 minutes were flown entirely on instruments. Crews called it formation by faith. Radio silence prevented coordination. Pilots depended on brief flashes of sunlight through overcast or the strobing of wingtips to gauge distance. A few feet of error might slice through a tail or shear off a wing. Ground crews sometimes found fragments of two aircraft fused together after mid-air collisions, an ugly sculpture of twisted aluminum, marking the point where human precision met atmospheric indifference. The 8th Air Force learned by loss. In February 1943, the 305th Bomb Group collided with its own low element, while forming above Northamptonshire 5 fortresses destroyed before reaching enemy territory. No flak, no fighters, just fog. Command revised procedures, adding more time between takeoffs, more altitudes for assembly. It helped little. By the end of that year, nearly 10% of all B-17 seconds lost in the European theatre had gone down without enemy action. Victims of formation accidents, fuel mismanagement, or icing. Crews began to joke grimly that the safest place to be was over Germany. At least there, you could see who was trying to kill you. The combat box itself, once formed, offered salvation and peril in equal measure. It concentrated firepower up to 300 .50 caliber guns bristling in a single wing formation, but it also meant flying inside a machine-made storm. The slipstream from hundreds of propellers churned the air into violent eddies. Tail gunners compared it to riding inside a thundercloud. Air turbulence slammed wings together. Engines screamed at full power to maintain speed in the buffet. When a ship took flak damage and slowed, the entire column behind it had seconds to swerve or climb. Those who failed tore through the crippled bomber in a chain reaction of destruction. Bomb runs magnified the danger. Over the target, every aircraft had to hold perfect line for the bombardier's synchronized release. No evasive action, no deviation, straight and level through flak. Pilots fought the urge to dodge as they watched other fortresses explode ahead of them. The discipline was inhuman, but it kept the pattern intact. After bombs away, the command rally right or rally left sent hundreds of aircraft banking simultaneously. Even then, collisions were common. One wing dipping a second too soon could sweep through another formation. Crews came home missing wingtips, tails crumpled, fuselages gouged by friendly propellers. The engineers called it efficiency. The crews called it survival math. Each mission's debrief listed not just enemy kills and flak damage, but assembly losses, formation disintegration, and unobserved collisions. These were the ghosts of the combat box, the invisible casualties of industrial war. Every time a pilot throttled up into fog, he trusted the same system that could crush him between two bombers moving at 150 miles per hour. He trusted that geometry could defeat chaos. At the end of a mission, when the surviving fortresses limped home and broke formation over the English coast, the radios came alive for the first time all day. Voices returned hoarse, relieved, human. Only then did the pilots admit to themselves how much they'd been holding in. For hours they had flown within spitting distance of death, not from flak or fighters, but from each other. That was the secret of the flying fortress. Its strength was collective, and so was its danger. Every man in the formation depended on the other's perfection. And perfection, like altitude, was something that could never quite be reached, only trusted, until the sky decided otherwise. The bomb bay was both the heart and the heart attack of the B-17. Every fortress carried between 4,000 and 8,000 pounds of high explosives, sometimes more if extra fuel tanks weren't required. The space itself was surprisingly small: 2 narrow catwalks, a metal beam barely wide enough for a boot, and a thin line of daylight visible through the bomb bay doors when they flexed in the slipstream. Walking through it in flight was a study in vertigo. Below lay 20,000 feet of air. Above, 1,000 gallons of aviation fuel sloshed in the wings. To crews, this was not a bomb bay. It was a cathedral of accidents, held together by faith, physics, and luck. Every mission began with ritual. Armourers loaded the bombs at dawn, in oil-stained overalls, while the crew stood clear. They inserted fuzzes at the hardstands only minutes before takeoff. One mistake, one dropped arming wire, and the explosion could erase a dozen aircraft. A stray spark was unthinkable, yet static electricity clung to everything. Wool uniforms, propeller wash, even the frozen air itself built charges strong enough to arc across metal. To combat it, ground crews clipped grounding cables from bomb racks to the tarmac, whispering superstitions under their breath. The manuals called it neutralizing potential difference. The men called it begging the airplane not to blow itself up before breakfast. Inside, the danger doubled. The B-17's fuel system fed 4 engines through a labyrinth of pumps and selector valves. Leaking fumes were common, especially after flak damage. An invisible vapor could linger in the bomb bay or radio compartment, mixed with pure oxygen from the crew system. One spark from a radio set, one flicked switch at the wrong time, and the fortress became its own incendiary device. Veterans remembered entire ships vanishing without a sound, just a flash where the bomb bay had been, then a black cloud drifting in formation's wake. The official phrase was, "exploded in mid-air." Those who saw it said the shock wave rattled their own aircraft 100 yards away. Yet the most insidious killer wasn't fuel or oxygen, it was the bombs themselves. They hung in 2 vertical rows, tail to nose, each on a shackle wired to the Norden bomb site. A malfunctioning release could leave one hanging after bombs away, its arming wire already pulled. Crews called it a hung bomb, and the procedure to dislodge it was among the most suicidal tasks in aviation. The bombardier would climb out onto the catwalk, often in -40 air, armed with a steel rod or wrench, and try to pry the live ordnance loose while the plane bucked in turbulence. If it fell free too early, it could detonate on the bomb bay doors. If it didn't fall at all, the ship might have to land with it still armed, a problem no manual could solve cleanly. Bomb release was supposed to be synchronized, hundreds of aircraft dropping simultaneously for pattern saturation. That precision, however, meant flying straight and level through flak for 30 unbroken seconds. Bombardiers watched the Norden's crosshairs drift across rail yards, refineries, cities, and all the while the ship shuddered from concussions close enough to dent the skin. The bay doors, thin as tin, rattled like drums. A direct hit from flak in that compartment could set off a sympathetic chain reaction, one bomb detonating the next, until the entire aircraft simply ceased to exist. On 14 October 1943, Black Thursday, 5 fortresses of the 100th Bomb Group vanished that way in less than a minute. To witnesses, they didn't fall, they evaporated. There was another fear, quieter but constant, other bombers' bombs. In a sky crowded with hundreds of fortresses stacked in tiers, one ship's ordnance could easily intersect another's flight path. It happened often. A crew might release a second too late or early, and their load would fall through the formation below. Bombs built to punch through concrete didn't care about aluminum. One tail gunner recalled watching a 500-pounder from above strike a B-17's left-wing root. "There was no explosion," he said. "It just folded her like paper, and she went down spinning." The debrief sheets recorded it as friendly collision bomb release. Fuel leaks and static made even minor turbulence terrifying. When clouds built up static charge, sparks leapt between rivets. Gunners reported seeing blue flames dance along the wings like Street Elmo's fire. It was beautiful and horrifying, a storm of electricity inches from fuel tanks and bomb fuses. Pilots kept one hand near the master switch, ready to cut power if the glow turned to flame. Radio operators wrapped equipment in blankets to prevent stray sparks from Morse keys or transformers. It was improvisation as survival, a constant awareness that everything aboard the fortress was flammable except fear itself. Yet, despite the danger, discipline held. The crew's trust in procedure bordered on religious. Checklists became scripture. Bomb bay doors open, master arm on, release circuit set. Bombardiers wore silk gloves not for comfort but to prevent static from their fingers. After the drop, they called "bombs away," and a collective exhale rippled through the ship. The sound of the load, leaving an almost imperceptible thump, was the sweetest note in the sky. Weightlessness replaced dread, and for a moment even the cold seemed to ease. Returning to base didn't end the tension. Landing with fuel fumes in the bay or an unexploded bomb beneath the catwalk was a test of nerve. Pilots often ordered the crew to bail out before attempting it. Ground crews cleared the runway and prayed. A fortress touching down with one armed bomb was a potential crater. With four, a disaster waiting to be named after its serial number. The myth of the flying fortress was that it could take anything the enemy threw at it. What the propaganda posters never said was that its greatest fragility lay within a symphony of gasoline, oxygen, static, and high explosive, barely kept in harmony by human attention. Every mission was an act of controlled combustion, and the line between fire and flight was measured not in armor or speed, but in respect. The crew's respect for the machinery that could kill them faster than any Messerschmitt. They flew because duty demanded it, and because somehow, against odds and logic, the machine usually brought them home. But every man who stepped through that narrow catwalk knew the truth. The posters never printed. The fortress did not forgive mistakes, only delay them. By 1944, the sky over Europe was as lethal to B-17 crews from within their own ranks as from the enemy. It wasn't treachery, it was physics, fatigue, and the grim arithmetic of industrialized war. When hundreds of four-engine bombers climbed together through ice and flak, they created a phenomenon the manuals didn't cover: the accidental crossfire of their own defensive guns, their own bombs, and their own debris. It was friendly fire, written in contrails and tracer lines. The fortress bristled with guns, 13 in the later models, 8, 50 calibers firing from multiple angles, their arcs of fire mapped in training films as perfect spheres of mutual protection. But those elegant diagrams didn't survive first contact with weather and fear. In real combat, gunners fired at shapes, flashes, and smoke trails. At 25,000 feet, depth perception failed. A fighter attacking from below could seem closer or farther by hundreds of yards. Tracer rounds curved under wind shear, and one bomber's defensive stream might cross straight through the airspace of another. Tail gunners told stories of seeing the tracer lines from the ship ahead, weaving into their field of view, so close they could feel the vibration of near misses on the fuselage. More than one waist gunner died from rounds fired by a nervous man 3 planes away. No one spoke of it officially, but debrief reports list stray fire own formation beside entries for flak and fighters. In the heat of combat, identification became guesswork, tiny silhouettes moving at closing speeds of 400 miles an hour. A second's hesitation meant death. A second's mistake meant killing your own. Commanders tried to regulate firing sectors. They issued orders: do not engage unless target crosses your line of sight below the horizon. But such neat geometry evaporated once the Luftwaffe appeared. In the confusion of contrails and smoke, the sky became a 3-dimensional cage. German fighters used it brilliantly. They dove through formations knowing American gunners were afraid to fire for fear of hitting each other. Then, just as the bombers began to relax, the enemy would climb back up from underneath, forcing a panic of overlapping gunfire that sometimes did more harm than the attack itself. Bombs, too, became friendly fire. Even with precise timing, the vertical spacing between combat boxes was often less than 1,000 feet. A bomber releasing a fraction early could rain its ordnance through the next formation. Falling bombs didn't tumble gracefully, they spun, drifted, sometimes broke apart from turbulence. Crews below could hear them whistling past, heavy objects moving at terminal velocity, each one capable of slicing through a wing or detonating against a fuselage. On the 26th of July 1943, over Hanover, one fortress of the 94th Group was struck by a 500-pounder from a higher box. The impact sheared off both wings. There was no explosion, just an aircraft unravelling in mid-air, its crew still strapped in their stations. Even fragments from other fortresses posed danger. A plane hit by flak often disintegrated in slow-motion engines, doors, and armour plates, turning into shrapnel fields that drifted backward through the formation. Those fragments hit like artillery shells. Veterans remembered seeing a wing panel the size of a dining table spinning toward them, slicing through the air. You couldn't dodge. The formation was too tight. Sometimes the debris punched holes straight through the fuselage, sometimes through men. When a bomber blew up ahead, the survivors flew through its remains, the air filled with ash, paper maps, insulation, and worst of all, pieces of other crews. There were other kinds of friendly fire, quieter but no less deadly. A pilot who lost an engine and fell out of formation became a magnet for the Luftwaffe, drawing enemy fighters that then sliced through his comrades to reach him. Some crews called those crippled ships flak bait, and though every man wanted to protect them, protocol demanded discipline. Keep formation, hold the line, do not dive after stragglers. To break ranks for a dying ship meant risking 20 others. It was a moral wound disguised as procedure. When fighters were finally driven off and the bombers turned home, the danger didn't end. Damaged fortresses limped back with jammed controls or frozen hydraulics, sometimes unable to lower landing gear or open bomb doors. Airfields in East Anglia saw daily collisions during approach planes with no brakes overshooting runways, others trying emergency landings while crews bailed out. The official records list them under returning aircraft accident. To the men on the ground, it was just another kind of friendly fire, death without an enemy's name attached. Psychologically, it gnawed at crews. Every mission demanded teamwork so precise that one man's mistake could kill 10 others. The fear of harming comrades sometimes outweighed fear of dying. Tail gunners reported freezing at their guns, unable to fire until they were sure of the silhouette. That hesitation, in turn, cost lives when the silhouette proved hostile. There was no solution. The fortress's strength, its collective defense, was also its flaw. It turned survival into shared risk, a fragile balance of trust under impossible conditions. When the missions ended and the surviving bombers taxied in, ground crews walked among them counting bullet holes and patched scars. Sometimes they found entry points without exits, proof that the bullet had come from another fortress, fired unknowingly by friends above. Pilots never blamed each other. There was nothing to forgive. They were all trapped in the same arithmetic: too many guns, too many planes, too little sky. In briefings, intelligence officers spoke of interlocking firepower and defensive coordination. But in the huts afterward, over black coffee and cigarettes, the men spoke of something else, the strange guilt of a war fought so close together that the line between ally and hazard blurred. It wasn't betrayal, it was geometry, logistics, and chance. As one veteran of the 384th Group put it, the enemy was out there somewhere, but half the time it felt like the sky itself was trying to kill us, and we were helping it do the job. That was the paradox of the flying fortress, engineered for cooperation, perfected for destruction, and always perilously close to turning both upon itself. By 1944, crews had stopped calling the B-17 the Flying Fortress, without irony. They shortened it to the Fort, or, more darkly, the Hog. The name fit big, loud, stubborn, and sometimes dangerous to feed. What had begun as a marvel of engineering had become, for its own men, a reminder that machines built for mass production didn't care who they hurt as long as they worked. Every bomber group kept a small cemetery of wrecks at the edge of its airfield, charred hulks that hadn't made it off the runway, or had come home too fast, or had landed short, scattering engines through hedgerows. The ground crews called it the boneyard. Pilots called it a mirror, a glimpse of where they'd end up if luck faltered by a degree. It wasn't enemy fire that filled those fields. It was the fortress itself. Runaway turbos, ruptured hydraulics, prop governors that failed and tore their own engines free. The supercharger system that gave the B-17 its high-altitude power was also its most treacherous component. Each engine had an exhaust-driven turbo on a network of ducts as complex as a submarine's plumbing. A single clamp left loose could turn the entire fuselage into a blowtorch. A gunner from the 384th remembered seeing a fellow ship ignite on climb-out. A line of fire ran down the right side like someone tracing it with a welding torch. They feathered the engine and kept climbing until the wing melted. No flak, no fighters, just metal too thin for the heat it carried. The fortress was armoured everywhere but inside. The oxygen lines that kept the crew alive were soft aluminum tubes filled with pure O2. A spark from a shorted wire or jammed turret motor could flash the entire system like a fuse. Pilots were trained never to use the interphone during an electrical fire, never to key the radio if a gunner's suit was sparking. More than one ship vanished from formation without a hit, just a sudden flare that left nothing but drifting fragments. Investigators would later find that a gun heater or radio transformer had arced against an oxygen manifold. The official cause: internal combustion ignition source undetermined. Unofficially, everyone knew the plane had eaten itself. Training films showed the fortress shrugging off damage, a wing full of holes, a stabilizer shredded, the bomber still flying home. The part they didn't show was what happened when the armor stopped working. A hit through the bomb bay could sever the main spar, and the immense weight of the wings would tear the fuselage in two. Crews joked that the fort couldn't be shot down, only broken in half. It wasn't far from truth. Every group had stories of planes returning with their tails held on by control cables, vibrating so violently that the waist gunners had to crawl forward on their stomachs. They called them flexible flyers. One more hit, one bad gust, and the airplane finished its own destruction. Even the guns, the symbols of the fortress's power, could turn traitor. The recoil from twin Brownings in the chin or tail turret was enough to jam their mounts or rupture hydraulic lines. If a gunner fired too long, the barrels overheated, and the empty casings bouncing off the fuselage could punch holes in control surfaces. Static build-up on the guns sometimes ignited tracer belts still feeding through the chutes. Crews called it the fort sneezing, a burst of flame across the wing roots. In the debrief forms, it became self-inflicted fire. Landing was the final test, and the most feared. With fuel low and hydraulics leaking, the fortress turned from predator to brick. Its heavy undercarriage could collapse if locked down too early. Its brakes overheated easily on the short British runways. Pilots learned to land long and pray the tailwheel held. Those who came in with wounded engines risked asymmetrical thrust, a sudden swing that flipped the plane before the wheels touched ground. Runway crews sprinted with extinguishers, pulling men from burning wrecks that had never left friendly skies. For all that, the engineers had done their work too well. The fortress was almost indestructible when it didn't destroy itself. There are photos from 1,944 of B-17 seconds landing with half a wing gone, engines dead, fuselages warped by fire. The men stepped down, dazed, as if the aircraft had willed itself home through sheer mechanical instinct. They would pat the scorched aluminum, even thank it. Then, as soon as they turned their backs, the ground crews would tow it to the boneyard, another monument to the paradox, a machine both saviour and executioner. The truth the veterans carried home was that the fortress's reputation came at a price. It survived by transferring risk from the outside to the inside, from enemy bullets to engineering margins. Every layer of armour, every redundant system, was another variable waiting to fail. The B-17 could absorb punishment beyond belief, but when it finally broke, it did so completely. No gliding, no partial victory, just a blossom of fire in a grey sky. The men didn't call that irony. They called it the cost of flying the most dependable killer in the air. By late 1944, the fortress had become a paradox made of aluminum and nerves. Every crew knew the odds. A third of bombers never completed their 25 missions. Posters still called it the Flying Fortress, unbeatable, unbreakable. But the men inside had stopped believing the myth. They had seen too many ships vanish in clear skies, too many friends erased without a single shot fired in anger. The enemy was everywhere, in the wiring, in the weather, in the blind trust that machinery and arithmetic would keep them alive. The system that fed the American air offensive was a miracle of coordination, and that was what made it lethal. Each airfield operated like a factory, ground crews swarming over bombers at dawn, refueling trucks, armorers, navigators, mechanics. A single spark, a single mistake, could kill hundreds before takeoff. On the 29th of January 1944, at RAF Grafton Underwood, a mechanic testing an auxiliary power unit triggered a fire that reached a fuel truck. The explosion destroyed 3 B-17 seconds, damaged 6 more, and killed 20 men before the mission even began. The war diary listed it under operational accident, a term as bloodless as the ashes it described. Electrical fires haunted the fortresses like ghosts. Each airplane carried miles of wiring, heated flight suits, interphones, oxygen valves, gun heaters, turret motors, and the endless array of fuses that tied it all together. At altitude, the wires grew brittle. A frayed line under a gunner's seat could smoulder for hours before the oxygen made it flash. Sometimes it started in the radio room, a glow spreading under the floorboards. By the time anyone noticed, the entire rear fuselage was a torch. Crews carried hand extinguishers filled with carbon tetrachloride, unaware that breathing the fumes could poison them faster than the smoke. They called it the fire that froze your lungs. Navigation errors were another hidden killer. The B-17 was a long-range aircraft, but its range depended on precision, and in Europe, precision was a luxury. Crosswinds, icing, and cloud banks swallowed landmarks. A single misread compass heading could drift an entire group into neutral Sweden or into German flak concentrations they were never meant to see. Once, in February 1944, a formation returning from Regensburg misidentified the English Channel and began descending over occupied France. 6 fortresses lowered their wheels for landing, thinking they were home. They were greeted by a line of 88mm guns. None survived. Then there was icing, invisible, silent, and merciless. Moisture froze to the wings faster than de-icing boots could handle, doubling weight and killing lift. Engines choked, props slowed, controls locked. Pilots fought to keep formation, even as the controls stiffened like stone. On winter missions, crews watched helplessly as aircraft ahead stalled and spun, trailing white frost instead of smoke. The official cause: weather. Among the men, it had another name, the clear sky coffin. Even on the ground, the fortress had appetites. Its engines drank 200 gallons of high-octane fuel per hour. Its oxygen tanks had to be purged, its guns loaded, its hydraulic pressure topped off. One careless act could ignite a chain reaction. Mechanics learned to walk bent, never upright, while the props were spinning one wrong step, and the invisible disc of a propeller could decapitate a man. In the roar of 4 engines, you never heard the scream. Pilots started every engine in sequence, each one vibrating the earth like a heartbeat. When a fuel line burst under pressure, the whole flight line went up like tinder. Ground crews sometimes joked that the fort was safer once it left. They weren't wrong. In the air, mid-air collisions remained the most feared form of friendly destruction. Each mission launched hundreds of bombers into the same corridor of sky. Clouds erased visibility, turbulence warped formations. When one ship exploded, the fragments scattered through the next wave like shotgun pellets. Veterans recalled seeing fireballs tumbling toward them, fragments of wings still burning, a tail spinning like a coin. Even when no debris hit, the concussion alone could flip a bomber on its back. You could live through 20 missions, only to die because another aircraft ahead of you had been hit 30 seconds earlier. The fortress demanded constant obedience to checklist, to hierarchy, to routine. But routine dulled the senses, and fatigue erased judgment. Crews flying 3 missions a week slept 4 hours a night, sometimes less. They lived in the smell of oil and cordite, half deaf from engine noise, half numb from cold. Mistakes multiplied, bombs armed too early, fuel tanks switched to empty, oxygen masks disconnected by accident. Each small error was survivable alone. Together they were fatal. The military called it pilot error. The men called it the war catching up. When veterans met after the war, they spoke of the B-17 with the affection one gives to a wild animal that never quite killed you. It had brought them home more times than it should have, but it had taken plenty, too. They remembered the smell of burning insulation, the blue arcs of static crawling across the canopy, the eerie silence after a near miss. It wasn't hatred they felt, it was awe, mixed with resentment. The fortress had done what it was built to do: endure, destroy, survive. But in doing so, it had made them part of its design replaceable components in a machine too vast to love them back. By VE Day, thousands of B-17 seconds sat wingtip to wingtip across English airfields, engines silent. They looked majestic in the spring sunlight, silver giants awaiting orders that would never come. Crews posed for photos beside them, smiling awkwardly, unsure whether to mourn or celebrate. When the scrapping began, some men wept. Others looked away, because deep down, every one of them knew the truth that wartime posters never dared admit. The fortress had not merely fought the war, it had been the war, and for all its glory, it had claimed nearly as many of its own as the enemy ever could.